Hey everyone, Peter here. Welcome to my very first posing video on my brand new channel, and thanks so much for tuning in. If you're new here, you can check out my other posing videos for The Mandalorian, Miles Morales, Iron Man, Thanos, and more. But today we'll be showcasing 12 poses from one of my most highly anticipated figures from the MCU, and that's Nebula by Hot Toys. Now, although this figure is labeled as Avengers Endgame, fortunately Nebula wore the same Ravager uniform in Guardians Volume 2 and Infinity War as well, and because she interacted with so many different characters throughout her cinematic journey, I knew she was a must-have Day 1 pre-order, as I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to pose her alongside her various MCU counterparts. And so, as usual, we'll kick things off with a few casual, safe poses like this one here before unleashing her rage. Now, it's worth mentioning that, although her figure is surprisingly posable, she does have a few minor drawbacks and safety concerns. For starters, her ankles don't really move because of her thick knee-high boots, but that's okay. We can overcome that obstacle by getting more creative with her overall posture. For example, we can give her some attitude by slightly tilting her head and chest back while placing her cybernetic arm on her hip, along with bending her left knee to distribute her balance onto her toes. Doing so gives us a fairly safe but natural looking pose that won't put too much stress on her suit. Now, another minor drawback is that her collar tends to rub up against her face when you turn her head, so I'd recommend sliding the collar underneath her chin to avoid possible paint damage, but just be mindful not to pinch the collar between her neck joint, otherwise that could cause a permanent fold or crease. Now, this next pose has the same fundamentals, but with a few minor tweaks of her left foot pulled forward so that her heel touches the ground, her body turned more inward to accentuate her curves, so to speak, and her right arm raised up to be aiming down her blaster. Now, although this is one of my favorite casual poses for Nebula, another minor concern that can easily be overlooked is that the gold Ravager badge on her shoulder is attached by a thin rubberized strap that can be pinched, wrinkled, or punctured depending on the severity of the pose, so be mindful of that area whenever raising her right arm. And as a bonus, if you happen to own Yondu in your collection, you can pair him up by placing him on his knees with his mechanical fin being blown off, just like in the film. It was actually this very scene which inspired the splatter pose to begin with, and I knew early on when Nebula's figure was first announced that this pose was going to be a lot of fun. Alright, now these next few poses will be utilizing her batons, and so here we have another safe but natural looking pose with her left arm stretched out horizontally as if she's taunting whoever's about to get their ass beat. Ironically, although this was meant to be an intimidating pose, it was actually inspired by a more comedic moment during the end credits of Guardians Volume 2 when Nebula can be seen dancing with a cybernetic shake. I just took what I remembered from that fun little sketch and threw in her batons. Also, although this pose is fairly easy to accomplish, the secret ingredient for getting her to look more natural and less toyetic is that it's all in her hips. If you watch her scenes carefully, it's quite noticeable that Karen Gillan really emphasizes Nebula's body language with head tilts and aggressive hip movements, so it really helps to sell the pose by utilizing the articulation at the waist. And moving along, if you've seen my previous videos, then you'll know I'm a huge fan of the walking pose. And so, of course, here we have Nebula walking towards her target in a bit of a seductive fashion. Once again, it's all in the hips. Now, I've mentioned previously that I prefer not using the included display stands unless absolutely necessary, but for a figure like Nebula who has narrow boots and no ankle articulation, sometimes it's inevitable. But we can also get away with it by simply balancing her batons onto another figure so that she doesn't fall over. And speaking of inevitable, it was only a matter of time until the almighty Thanos made an appearance alongside his adopted daughter. Alright, and here we have our first aggressive pose for Nebula, and so for this one, I wanted to experiment with the stability of her boots and flexibility of her suit by putting her in a wide battle stance. Now, although she is quite posable, despite having a form-fitted uniform, it's worth mentioning that aggressive poses like this will undoubtedly crease and wrinkle her suit. Many of you probably know by now that my passion for posing outweighs my concern for a few wrinkles here and there, but I know it's a valid concern for others, so as always, pose within your own comfort level and do whatever works best for you. Now, these next few poses will focus a bit more on Nebula's vulnerable side, and so here we have her standing over Tony after their epic battle on Titan as she quickly realizes that her father actually accomplished what he set out to do while Tony struggles to accept his overwhelming failure. Now, the diorama base that I used for rubble and debris comes from the die-cast Iron Man Mark 43, and my Tony Stark kit bash is comprised of the Super MC Toys Nano Combat Suit along with the Max Nut battle-damaged head sculpt. Now, in terms of the continuity of this pose, I know that Nebula and Tony didn't really foster a companionship until they became stranded in space, but I wanted to convey Nebula's newfound sense of emotional awareness and empathy because, like Tony, she too had just lost someone that she loved and cared for very much, and I think that's what makes her story arc so underrated and compelling. I mean, she was originally introduced as a bit of a snobby, selfish, subservient, and unloyal henchwoman to the more powerful supervillains like Ronan the Accuser and Thanos. But with great storytelling, incredible acting, and proper character development, we learned throughout her journey that she's so much more. And so another great scene that I absolutely loved in Endgame was when Nebula and Rocket shared a brief but tender moment together. If you recall their previous encounters, they kinda hated each other, and she even called him a stupid fox a few times. But through her small gestures of kindness and compassion, such as giving Tony the last ration of food, or simply clasping Rocket's hand, we quickly learned that beneath her cybernetic shell and constant projection of rage and fury lies a complex and layered girl who just wanted to be acknowledged and loved despite suffering through a lifetime of abuse by her adoptive father. And so to see them grieve together in silence as they console one another over the traumatic loss of their shared family was such a powerful moment, as they were now the last surviving members of the Guardians of the Galaxy. In any case, moving along, we have another scene from the beginning of Endgame, where the Avengers have tracked down Thanos with the help of Nebula's intel, and Rhodey suggests that Thanos must be lying upon learning that the Infinity Stones have been destroyed. And as Nebula begins to defend her father's integrity, Thor succumbs to all his guilt and anger by going straight for the head, leaving Rocket and everyone else in utter shock and disbelief. Now, in terms of Nebula's pose, I could have been a little more accurate by folding both knees in so she'd be much closer to her beheaded father, but I wanted to keep her somewhat viewable so I could still appreciate her figure from afar rather than having her hunched over entirely. Alright, now for this next pose, we'll be traveling back to 2014, where we finally see armored Thanos make his appearance halfway through Endgame, and it's when he quickly becomes suspicious of Nebula as her synaptic drive malfunctions, showing a recording of her future self plotting against him to obtain the Power Stone on Morag. Now, if you do decide to recreate this pose, be mindful when balancing Thanos, especially in a cramped space like a Detolf. He needs to lean forward quite a bit in order to sell the pose, but too much lean can cause him to topple over or stab Nebula in the neck or face with his glaive, so be careful when posing. And skipping ahead to the final battle of the universe, here we have an exhausted and perplexed Hawkeye as he lays on the ground completely defenseless after unknowingly handing over the Infinity Stones to the wrong Nebula. Now, I suppose another minor drawback to Nebula's figure is that despite being categorized as an endgame figure, she doesn't come with an interchangeable orange plate on the forehead. It probably could have been done magnetically, but it wasn't a deal breaker at all for me. Plus, if anything, an orange plate for this figure wouldn't really be screen accurate anyways, since she was wearing an entirely different outfit at this point in the film. Also, the Nano Gauntlet here is included with the Endgame Rocket figure, but in case you don't own him, you can actually buy a similar Nano Gauntlet keychain from various sites like Amazon and eBay for around 10 or 15 bucks. Alright, and for our final pose, I wanted to recreate Nebula's grandiose entrance to the Battle of Titan, where she crashes her ship directly into Thanos, followed by landing an epic aerial left hook right to his jaw. Not that it really did anything to him, but I thought this was such a badass moment for her, because we'd seen previously that she would kneel at his feet in servitude, or tremble in fear for her life when overpowered, and so to see her summon the strength and courage to finally stand up to her lifelong abuser was a pivotal and satisfying moment in her character development. Now, when it comes to her aerial pose, all I did was insert a bent metal wire into the backside of her suit. I suppose a large paper clip could also work, but I didn't have any. Now, it might look like a bit of a mess, but it's actually just one single wire around 10 inches long that's been folded over multiple times for better structural integrity. Then I just carefully inserted the rounded hook into the small gap between Thanos' shirt and his chest. That way I could have her posed in a mid-action aerial punch without the obstructions of a dynamic stand getting in the way. And there you have it, 12 different pose ideas for one of my favorite characters in the MCU, Nebula by Hot Toys. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this video, as I have a lot of fun making this type of content for fellow collectors to learn from and enjoy. If you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments which pose you enjoyed the most and if you'll be using any of them for your display. I'll have them up on Instagram over at posingwithpeter16. Also, I have a lot of new content on the way, ranging from Beskar Mando and modifying his fat suit tutorial, showcases for some older figures like RoboCop and The Matrix, a potential music video for my 3-0 Transformers, and more, so be sure to subscribe for more content like this. As always, thanks so much for watching. Please stay safe, take care, and we'll see you in the next video.